Chapter 5. Casey, the Master of Spies. On a beautiful spring day in April or May of 1981, a car pulled up in front of my hotel in Washington, D.C. The scene was right out of a spy novel. A man designated as my liaison came to my room and announced we were ready to drive out to Langley, Virginia, in suburban Washington. I gave my military attaché and other aides the day off because no one was authorized to come along. This was to be a solitary affair, for me alone. It was also to be my first meeting with William Casey, the old OSS warrior who had now been appointed by President Ronald Reagan as the Director of Central Intelligence. The route was familiar. I had been to CIA headquarters a number of times in the past, including for several meetings with Vernon Walters, a former deputy CIA director and diplomat. But now, in the Reagan administration, I was once again to be the point man between Torrijos and the U.S. government. Both sides wanted the intelligence relationship between the countries to change. Panama had always been a meeting place for espionage, a free port of call for East and West, North and South. But our government and our military never had much interest in spying. Two things changed that. First, the 1969 coup, which Torrijos blamed on the CIA, sensitized him to the necessity of intelligence operations. When he saw that his forces had been infiltrated by the CIA and others to organize the coup against him, he reacted by dismissing all those officials who had collaborated with the U.S. Army's 470th Intelligence Brigade, headquartered at Fort Clayton, near Miraflores locks on the Pacific side of the Panama Canal. He did the same thing with the people accused previously of working with the CIA. But at the same time, he saw that the military forces could not isolate themselves, because that would provoke even more interest among the Americans to seek out intelligence by any means possible. He decided, therefore, that there must be a channel of communication. That is where I entered the picture. Fresh from having organized Torrijos' rescue in Chiriquí, I was brought in for the assignment. I was to be the sole person responsible for communications between Torrijos and the U.S. intelligence services, be it the CIA, military intelligence, or the FBI. As the head of G2, the military intelligence service within the National Guard, I was authorized to maintain contact at any level with the Americans. Torrijos even restricted his own contact with the Americans. During his entire time in power, he never met with any chief of the Southern Command. That was the measure of his resentment toward the U.S. military and the United States for its role in the 1969 coup. The second reason for moving into intelligence and counterintelligence was the advent during the Nixon administration of serious preparations toward the Panama Canal treaties. That was when the United States began to tap telephones, especially Torrijos' lines, to keep a close watch on him. The United States was interested in anything that had to do with Torrijos, where he ate, where he slept. We knew this, and we reacted with countermeasures. We changed telephone numbers, planted false information, and significantly, we set up spy operations of our own. By the mid-1970s, we had successfully infiltrated U.S. forces in the Canal Zone. We reached out to civilian workers, office people, and soldiers, the basic idea being to cultivate informants who had access to documents and data we needed. This was the same thing that the Americans were doing to us. We gathered intelligence by capitalizing on human weaknesses. Women, alcohol, all of the vulnerabilities that made it possible to get people to give us information. We had Anglos, Puerto Ricans, quite a number of people. Look at this picture. An American rotates into Panama every 2 years. He wants company, and all of a sudden, he is showered with it, being invited to Panamanian houses, going to parties, developing a warm relationship with a Panamanian family. Whatever it is, you win the true friendship of this person so that you gain absolutely his or her sympathy. Panamanian intelligence services came of age in the 1970s because we were able to establish significant access to information right under the nose of the Americans. The most important group of U.S. informants came to be known as the Singing Sergeants. They were eventually discovered and caused great embarrassment to the U.S. Southern Command, who couldn't believe that any American would spy for Panama. The sergeants were very helpful in obtaining the material important to us, security information relating to Torrijos and the other commanders, as well as operational information. When they came up with other strategic information about the United States and its relations with other countries, it was of no interest to us, and we simply destroyed it. My philosophy in dealing with the Americans was to keep most intelligence contacts above board, to establish an easy, frank conduit for providing information. It is said in intelligence circles that curiosity is the source of many mistakes. My job was to make sure the Americans would not miscalculate because of too little or wrongly developed information. I wanted to keep the Americans abreast of what Panama was doing. It was an effort to combat the rumors and misinformation spread about the country and about the canal. The source of these was an anti-military, anti-Torrijos, anti-nationalist lobby that included the wealthy classes of Panama who opposed Torrijos, the military, and me, and would do anything, invoke the Red Menace, for example, to derail the treaties. My assignment from Torrijos was to downplay spying, nurturing instead a relationship of respect and friendship, and speaking openly with the U.S. intelligence services. We talked about our political goals. They could see that we were not communists, and as we explained ourselves to the Americans, a professional understanding developed, contacts that would avoid any confusion about purpose and motives. I started traveling to Washington several times a year, along with other Panamanian officials. As a result of these efforts, the Americans began requesting that we carry out missions for them, pinch hitting when the United States needed an intermediary. This was seen in our handling of Cuban contacts and in our help to the United States during the Iran crisis, when we gave asylum to the Shah of Iran. As a result of these dealings, it is always inferred that I was some sort of U.S. agent, which was never the case. I was a Panamanian official, and I openly conducted myself as such in all my relations with the United States, for the good of my country, my army, and with the full knowledge of my commander, General Torrijos. My visit to CIA headquarters that spring day was with a full understanding on both sides of what the relationship had been. I was still a colonel and head of G2, invited by Casey and on a courtesy visit at the behest of Torrijos. That was, of course, always an air of intrigue on visits to CIA headquarters. The car pulled off the parkway after less than an hour's drive. Security arrangements were made at the front gate, and then I was driven into the CIA grounds, directly to the imposing administration building. I recall crossing the threshold, looking in passing at the globe of the world inlaid in the floor of the venerable old headquarters and at the stars on the wall, representing the CIA agents killed in duty around the world. There was a lone receptionist seated in the large foyer. The cavernous dimensions of this empty space gave no outward projection of the espionage and intrigue one could imagine going on throughout the premises. I was ushered into a morning of meetings with staff aides. Casey, I was told, would meet us just before lunch. We spent the morning in a series of chats that set the stage for what they were thinking about. Inevitably, the talks revolved around the strategic importance of Panama and the Panama Canal and their plan for the United States to remain in Panama after the year 2000. I can remember only faces, not names, in these talks. At the CIA, I don't think the use of names is a high priority. It may be Mr. Clark and Mr. Smith and Mr. Jones, but I had little thought that these were the real names of the people I was talking to. The only surnames mentioned with any certainty during the morning were those of Colonel Noriega and Mr. Casey. There was an informal air to these conversations, but certain themes were repeated for emphasis. Colonel, the United States is concerned about the security of the region. With the Sandinistas, we are worried about Cuban and Soviet influence all around your government, one of the anonymous men said. Colonel, said another, Panama and the Panama Canal are a choke point for transport and communications throughout the hemisphere. We know how important you are to us. As I reflected on these themes, it was clear that the United States was not talking about a little canal built 3/4 of a century earlier that was becoming obsolete and too small for the world's greatest commercial fleets. What value, I thought, did a tiny canal built in 1904 have? No. The Americans were talking about their dominion over a geographical area that they saw as strategically vital, just as much now in the Cold War as it always had been. They were looking at a chessboard. They controlled the pieces at an important stalemate. Panama was still the crossroads of the hemisphere. At the close of the century, the Americans saw Panama just as Teddy Roosevelt had seen it in 1904. This land was theirs, and they wanted it all for their own. In the late morning, I was ushered into the office of William Casey. He was not exactly an imposing man, standing there, hunched over and handling himself like any other American businessman, but with the appearance of a kindly old grandfather. Still, I was impressed with him. He seemed to be a classic, old-style intelligence officer, and I found a great kinship in that. Here was a man who had been consumed by the process and the art of intelligence gathering. While many of the morning meetings were with Spanish-speaking intelligence officers, a translator was always present. This was especially necessary with Casey. My knowledge of English did little good. He cocked his head as he spoke from a turned lip with words that tripped out in ways I couldn't understand at all. And yet, with the help of translation, our chat, extending 2 hours or so over a luncheon in an adjoining dining room, was animated. "Colonel Noriega," he said, "we want to do everything we can to maintain the cooperation we have established with you and your country." "As do we," I told Casey. "General Torrijos has asked me to tell you that he looks forward to a friendly, open relationship." In addition, I told him, Torrijos asked me to describe our philosophy of openness, that we should talk frequently and openly to avoid misunderstanding. The CIA ends up being blamed for every little thing because of the aura of mystery that surrounds it, I said. We need to keep the lines open so we can change that. Casey was interested in hearing about the CIA role in the 1969 coup against Torrijos. I told him what I knew. He smiled when I talked about the mystery we ascribed to the spy agency. "I'd like to come to Panama soon and visit with the general," he said. He wanted a channel of communication with Cuba without any obligation. The chats were in part protocol, in part an early attempt to raise the key issues that Casey and the Reagan administration wanted to promote. Central America, he said, was on the verge of being overrun by communism. Panama was uniquely situated to observe events in Central America because our doors were open to all sides. The United States knew this and welcomed our openness and our help, he said. I said little during the first briefing by Casey on the Central American plan. I never harbored any illusion that Washington really cared what I thought. It was a situation in which special foreign visitors, allies, and potential allies are brought to the CIA for a briefing. The CIA representatives present their view of the world, ask polite questions of their guests, and sit calmly and courteously when it's the visitor's turn to talk. This is what they call their foreign policy, supporting democracy worldwide. It is really a recipe for making sure that their own form of repression is being disseminated. Casey gave no operations details of what was planned by the Reagan administration. Instead, I got the party line, a general perspective of the struggle they had before them. Casey made it clear what he and Reagan and Bush thought the stakes were. The United States is concerned about the Cuba-Grenada-Nicaragua triangle, he said. We need to contain the communist threat because Cuba and Russia will take any opportunity to subvert democracy. We plan to meet the challenge. He said that the United States would take all possible steps, including covert action and mounting guerrilla insurgencies, to block Cuban and Soviet-inspired designs. They were ready to do whatever they could to eliminate Marxist-Leninist insurgencies wherever they found them, and especially to repel and terminate any involvement, communication, or dependence on Fidel Castro anywhere in Latin America. Of course, we can't let the Central Intelligence Agency get involved directly, Casey told me. We can't let it appear as though we were taking direct action here. We need help. Over lunch, the chat was more anecdotal. As we reviewed the world scene, Casey was especially interested in my contacts with Israeli officials. I told him, for example, about having met Moshe Dayan and Yitzhak Rabin shortly after the 1967 Six-Day War. Dayan, the triumphant general, took me on a tour of the war zone and described strategic planning that went into fighting the Syrians. We discussed Israeli theories of intelligence gathering. I recalled having met Dayan another time during a later trip at the Tel Aviv Hilton, riding down the elevator with him and a woman who was thrilled to have the opportunity to stand so close to the war hero. I met him! I shook his hand! The woman shrieked as she ran off into the lobby. Dayan smiled mildly. At the time, he was a civilian and was not in the government. Rabin, I told Casey, by comparison was aloof and formal. My chat with him was about peace between the Arabs and the Israelis. Dayan was effusive and personal, making more of a lasting impression. Casey listened intently as I shared my impressions of these men. I find this to be an important quality. He was a person who had the culture, social grace, and intelligence to listen when others spoke. This meeting was the start of a closer relationship with the CIA, which, for my part, was always characterized by equanimity. Over the years, my CIA contacts knew full well that I was a reliable conduit of messages from the United States to the Cubans. That communications link was defended by Casey, and he could count on me to keep it open. He visited me several times in Panama at my home. When Casey and the CIA asked for passports and visas so that their operatives could carry out specific intelligence missions, for example, Panama, under my command, gave them that help and more. If, as was the case, the United States sought a channel of communication with the Russians, they knew that they could rely on me for clean and reliable transmission of information. We did not request or ever receive information on what any of these operations might have been. U.S. intelligence was highly compartmentalized. We never got an inkling of the targets or results in any such requests. Never did any double dealing or bad information come out of Panama as a result of this relationship, which was handled always with a high level of respect. The Americans knew that they would get nothing more and nothing less from me than that. Even in the depths of our bad relations with the Americans, certain intelligence information was protected. There was, for example, a National Security Agency center at the Southern Command known as the Tunnel. Built into the side of a hill in Quarry Heights, the facility looked unassuming from the outside. Inside was the most complete, top-secret defense and spying center imaginable. It was used for tracking Cuba, for monitoring drug trafficking and spy planes. During our period of cooperation on hemisphere drug interdiction in the early 1980s, drug surveillance was handled from the tunnel. We never told anyone of its existence. I had been the U.S. contact person throughout the 1970s, and I was well known to everyone in the CIA. Now, with Casey, the relations would become tighter. In 1983, when I assumed command, the CIA was pleased to have a direct connection with the leader of the Panamanian military. Even though I appointed my own G2 intelligence chief, Casey came down soon after I assumed command to make it clear that his organization was happy to deal with me directly. But I was under no illusions. Neither Panama nor I was ever central to the game being played by the Americans. We, in turn, never allowed Panama to become a pawn in that game. Their Central American plans started to go too far. We viewed their support for the Salvadoran military and the crazed war they organized against the Sandinistas as irresponsible and unbalanced. This was not our battle, and we thought it was wrong-headed. Moreover, we supported the Sandinista revolution and understood the nationalist aspirations of the FMLN guerrillas in El Salvador. With the advent of their war, the United States began to make demands that we could not meet and applied more pressure than we could tolerate. Up until then, I had been Mr. Yes, the man on whom the Americans could always depend. Now, I had started to become known as Mr. No, and Mr. No, the Reagan administration decided, had to be destroyed. Yet I am convinced that history would have been altered and the December 20th, 1989 invasion of Panama never would have taken place if Casey had lived. Casey had the power and the inclination to defend me against the conspiracy that was developing against me, spurred on by Panamanian opponents and their friends in Washington. Casey knew what was going on in Panama. The drug trial would not have worked if he were alive, because I would have had him as a living testament and defender. He knew the truth about all the charges against me. He knew the truth about the Spadafora killing and the drug pilots flying for Bush's Contras. Neither the Americans nor the Allies ever understood why we would not help them. It was not in our strategic national interest to do so. It was not our belief that communism was about to overrun Latin America. It was not our intention to oppose liberation movements. We weren't interested in helping the Americans in that way. Strategically, it made no sense. We didn't want to be the handmaidens of the Americans, and everybody in the region knew, whether they understood it or not, that this was our position. Because of this, our relations at times were strained with the closest U.S. allies, the Salvadorans and Hondurans and the Contras, because they knew that we had a different way of looking at the United States. I had this argument many times with many different people. 3 are worth mentioning. General Gustavo Alvarez Martinez of Honduras, Captain Roberto D'Aubuisson of El Salvador, and a lieutenant colonel from the United States named Oliver North. I was fascinated by all three. Alvarez because of how naive he was and because of what happened to him. D'Aubuisson because of his one-track mind and annihilating communism as if it were a disease. And North because of all the power he professed to have.